Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. So today we'll be talking about retcons. And retcons always are a tricky thing in media, doubly so when you're dealing with an IP that really is as old as World of Warcraft. Especially now that Blizzard are also trying to really tell more of the story in-game, and they're also trying to tidy up their lore with the whole Warcraft Chronicle initiative. Now, examining the retcons I think gives us a great insight into the creative process, and while they can be annoying, they can open up some really cool storytelling opportunities. Previously, I talked about the Draenei, the Titan, and the Burning Crusade sort of reimaginings that Blizzard did. They're three retcons that were so large that they packed a full video that was full of edits. Today we're going through some retcons that are a little bit smaller topics, but still ones that I think are really interesting. And we're going to kick it off with Light and God. So I'm really happy that I'm actually doing this video after 7.3 launched. The events of the Xera cinematic certainly do make the light side seem more fallible. I think that's kind of cool. A bit similar to the Angels in Diablo 3, where technically they are good, but their lack of respect for personal freedoms and their ends justify the means attitude means that really they're a lot more grey in practice. It's also useful that I brought up Angels here, because the original incarnation of the light in World of Warcraft was very different. It was very much a parallel with Christianity. Now, as time went on, we've really seen the role of the light change. It's now more of a force, with the Naru being more of an embodiment of that force. We've also seen some more suggestions that the Naru are really not as good as we may have thought, or perhaps, well, either they're not as good as we thought, or perhaps they operate in a world that is so black and white and simplistic that it really is sort of simple in comparison to the more complex morality that humans have developed both in the in-game canon but also in the real world. Then the topic of the light and the void is another interesting one that ties into this. It's became ever more clear that the light and the void are sort of sides of a coin, at least I think, and we see really with that a greater parallel with the Force from Star Wars. So there you go, we started off with a Christianity-like religion and we've now ended up with a souped-up version of the Force. Next, let's talk about Egwene's personality. So they actually changed her personality in Chronicle Volume 1. She used to be quite an arrogant character. Ultimately, she was a bit of a victim of her own hubris. She was really quite cold, basically. Now, as an example, in the original canon, she pretty much used Aran in The Last Guardian. So she didn't want the Guardian of Tirisfal to be appointed by the Council, so she wanted to choose the successor herself. And to do that, she manipulated him into getting her pregnant. So yeah, I know that happened, but basically it meant that the child could be, born in secret, and then she could pass the powers on to that child. Well, in the new story, it's more of a love story. It's, she's a little bit less cold, and I think there's definitely a unique twang to that character that has been lost in the process. So next we've got the Old Gods, and much like with the Titans, the Old Gods have had a fundamental change. They used to be very much an intrinsic evil in Azeroth, but now they're essentially just a parasite that seeks out world souls for the Void Lords. This is a pretty big change when you really think about it, and what's began to interest me a lot is that if the Old Gods are manifestations, or they're created by the Void Lords, what is the light side equivalent of an Old God? Is it the Naru? Is it Elune? Hard to know, but an interesting question. Now that Blizzard have clarified what an Old God is, there really is a hell of a lot of room for expansion to their potential, what their potential equivalent on the light side of things is, and who knows, that could be something that's revealed in a future expansion now that we will be doing a lot more Void stuff. Okay, let's ratchet it back a bit and talk about the War of the Ancients. It's got the potential to be a mess because of time travel, but we don't know. The retcon might get retconned because Warcraft Chronicle tells the tale of the original War of the Ancients as it happened. Now, of course, the War of the Ancients novels sort of happened after that, but hey, it's a bit strange. Anyway, in the novels, Ronan, Krasus, and Broxigar went back to just before the War of the Ancients kicked off through a hole in time that they found in the mountains because why not, I suppose? While they did alter the timeline slightly by being there, the broad strokes of the war pretty much is similar. Okay, a few characters with slightly different personalities and things like that, but overall, the Legion did get foiled. Now, there are some oddities that are created by this. Tyrande does not recognize orcs in Warcraft 3, even though she fought beside Broxigar during the War of the Ancients. As for Broxigar, though, there is a really nice nod to him and his sort of famous last stand in patch 7.3, so you can actually find that, which is a nice little nod to the canon lore. And I've got to imagine that it is indeed canon if Broxigar has been put into this, and maybe Warcraft Chronicle Chapter 3 or 4 will cover the altered events due to the time travel novel. Okay, next, let's talk about the Titans. So the role of the Titans overall has changed a decent bit, though I'm going to keep this brief because I haven't covered this before. So the core difference here is that Sargeras was driven mad by the Eridar in the original lore, but in the new lore, basically he seduces them into joining the Legion. In the old lore, the Void threat didn't exist, so the whole dynamic was different. Sargeras was driven mad by disillusionment with the Titans' quest to order the universe, and the whole concept of a Titan world soul did not exist, and the Titans had ordered millions and millions of worlds purely because they believed in order over chaos, not because they were driven to find world souls. Now, the fate of the Titans does sort of change. It seemed like everyone thought they were alive back in Wrath, but that has kind of been maybe changed. So we always assumed they were alive, but in the new lore, they're actually long dead, bar the fact that Norgannon managed to save their souls, which is a new invention of Chronicle. And speaking of those souls, let's talk about the souls, but first a warning, this contains patch 7.3 raid spoilers. So, Antorus does a really strange one here in that it actually contradicts information from Chronicle, or at least there's stuff that we don't know and doesn't necessarily make sense. So the original story is that after being completely blasted by Sargeras at Nihilum, the Pantheon's souls made their way towards Azeroth. They just sort of floated through space. They were then absorbed by the Titan Keepers, none of whom really knew what happened bar Raden, who pretty much knew what the crack was. Now, somehow these souls have made their way into Antorus in the new raid. How? Well, I really have no idea, and it's not really explained in a good way. Though in fairness, it has allowed for the raid to have a really cool premise, but that does seem like a pretty major retcon. Okay, let's talk about Garona's parents. She's always been a bit of an interesting character, especially with Blizzard changing her backstory a little bit. Originally, she was half orc, half human, and there was some pretty dark stuff involved in her backstory. When she was first conceived as a character, the Draenei didn't exist, so it made sense that she would be sort of half human. But later on, with the inclusion of the Draenei, things were changed to make her essentially be a half orc, half Draenei. And once again, she didn't have a particularly happy upbringing. Really, she's got a pretty shit time of it in every timeline. Anyway, while this is separate canon, I want to bring up the Warcraft movie here because it handled her backstory in, I think, a pretty cool way. So, this is a movie spoiler, but in the movie, Medivh, in his younger years, was traveling, and he wasn't interrailing across Europe with his friends. No, he was the Guardian, so he was using portals and visiting far-off places. And while he was using his portals, he ended up, he got a bit of that fell corruption, but he also got a slice of that orc action, and while I can't really agree with his tastes, well, the backstory here is pretty damn cool. So, he fell for an orc, and that led to Garona being born, making her the daughter of Medivh. And they only really got to hint at this in the movie. I think it was pretty obvious, but it seems like a lot of people didn't pick up on that during the movie, but I thought it was a really good idea and created a really nice tie between these characters, which gave more emotional weight to a few scenes. So I think it was a pretty cool move, and if they retconned the main universe to that somehow, I wouldn't mind, even though the flip-flopping would be ridiculous. Another strange one is the Broken Isles in Legion. So there are some oddities with the Broken Isles. The area was supposedly just sunk and then risen again during Warcraft 2. And at that time, it was essentially just a ruined area. Now, that lore has been changed for Legion. They actually made it so that Gul'dan actually rose Thal Drinath, not the other zones. Some had been sort of confused at the idea of places like High Mountain and Stormheim being underwater. That never was the case, and these places are pretty much new additions to the lore surrounding the Kingdom of Suramar. Well, not kingdom, but the area of Suramar for the Night Elves. Now, not to get too speculative, but I have seen some people talk about the idea of other islands being raised out of the sea, giving us ways to explore some of the Naga lands, perhaps in an expansion that would be tied into Kulturas, which maybe makes sense with Jaina being the key art for BlizzCon. Hard to know, but basically with Legion, we were able to get a whole continent out of what previously, lore-wise, had just been an elf city. So I'm pretty sure they would be able to do similar in the future if they really needed to. And that's one thing that changed from Warcraft 3 to the Burning Crusade was the status of the Blood Elves. We pretty much thought that the actions of Garithos and the other humans just drove all the Blood Elves to leave with Kael'thas on his journey to Outland. The level of destruction to their home area seemed to be a bit more complete as well. Of course, in the Burning Crusade, they changed that to facilitate them being a playable race, and they made it so that only the strong went with Kael'thas, and that his actions were pretty much eventually not approved by those who were left behind, who, of course, were in the Horde and, well, you know, took part in killing Kael'thas. Okay, next we're going to cover Blackhand, and his story has basically flip-flopped since Warlords of Draenor. Warlords gave him a new backstory and a new look, and that story starts with Ogrim Doomhammer years ago, who heard a prophecy from Velen. Velen told him that the last of the Doomhammer line would use it to bring first salvation, but then doom to the Orc people. Velen's prophecy also did include that eventually the Doomhammer would pass to another and would be used for the cause of justice, just not within the Doomhammer line. Now, of course, Ogrim was spooked by this, so he eventually brought it to the pool of lava where it was forged. And the Elemental Furies, well, they were displeased and they took the hammer from him. Now, at the same time, they were under siege from ogres and things did not look particularly good. Blackhand was taken to Ogrim, and after a brief chat, Blackhand tried to claim the hammer for himself. The elements partially encased him in lava, but Blackhand was able to battle through the pain and claim the hammer. So he then came out with he came out of that experience with basically the hammer, but also knowledge of crafting. And then he worked into the night using the Doomhammer to forge new weapons for his warriors. And then at dawn, they attacked the ogres, and they were victorious. Blackhand then gave the Doomhammer back to Ogrim, saying that it is his family's legacy. And then he looked at his lava-infused arm and said that he's got his own legacy to forge. Now, this is a more fantastical take on the character's backstory, and it was just a bit too much for the canon. So Blizzard have went back on it for his official appearance and backstory in Warcraft Chronicle. Frankly, I think one of the reasons I wanted to bring this retcon up is because it does highlight a pretty cool little story. Okay. That's it. That's really what I think is interesting to cover. There are some things like, say, the naming of particular orc clans, changing the origin of Frostmourne from the Lich King to the Nathrezim, and then, say, the homeland of Chen Stormstout, which technically are retcons, but I really don't think that they're worth talking about that much. This really is what I think is the interesting stuff. And that's pretty much all the major retcons that I really care about covered between these two videos. So there you go, a little bit of a look into a scattershot through the Warcraft lore and some of the things that Blizzard have felt it was a good idea to change. So that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.